see a lot of sort of body blows happening to the food inspection program that are going to take a long time to dig out of, and the shutdown sets them further behind.
Hello, welcome to FDA Watch. I'm Wayne Pines, your host. As you know, we're the only independent national forum dedicated to discussing FDA issues. I do want to remind you that if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you can do so very, very easily. Go to fdawatch.net, fdawatch.net. You put in your email address, click on subscribe. It's free. When you do subscribe, you'll get an email whenever a new episode appears, as well as access to our headlines, our resource links, as well as some additional background about our guests. In this episode, we're going to be talking about food issues. We have two great guests. We'll meet them in just a minute. But first, I want to get to some headlines. And this week, we have an awful lot of headlines. As we all know, the FDA is back in business following the end of the 43-day government shutdown. Unlike most other agencies, FDA is now set with a budget until next September 30th. So it's not really going to be susceptible to any budgetary problems that might exist over the next few months as the Congress passes additional budgets. The 15 to 20% of FDA employees who were furloughed are now back. It'll be business as usual as it was before the shutdown. That was a little bit different from the way that FDA was in previous years, but nevertheless, all the employees are now back at their desks. From the Pharma desk, we have lots of headlines. The big news, of course, is that Rick Pazdur, who's the longtime head of the Oncology Center, has been named director of the Center for Drugs. Rick is well known in the FDA community. He's been at the agency for 26 years. He has fast-tracked a lot of new oncology drugs. I understand that he was initially reluctant to take the job, but was persuaded to do so. The staff at CDER, which, as I mentioned before, is now back, should react favorably since Rick is well known, obviously knows the agency, knows the center, knows science. Over the next few months, we'll be discussing what Rick Pazdur is doing in future podcasts. A second Pharma headline is that FDA has announced its next round of priority review of vouchers. They provide for drug reviews within 1 to 2 months. We'll see how successful that program is. A lot of optimism that it will work and get new drugs onto the market more quickly than previously. And finally, on the Pharma front, FDA Commissioner Makary and CDER Director Prasad have developed a blueprint for approving very personalized gene editing therapies. This could have a major impact on the development of gene therapies for, I'll use this term, ultra rare diseases that are treated with gene therapies. This is a very important development for a small segment of patients, but a very important segment of patients and for the future of gene therapy. So lots of headlines from the Pharma desk. From the device desk, there was a recent analysis by MD and DI that found that the regulatory review process for medical devices has slowed down. 510K review times, according to MD and DI, averaged 140 to 175 days. Up to 80% of the submissions exceeded the 90-day target. According to MD and DI, cuts of 220 plus positions at CDRH are creating operational challenges that may further extend review times. This is something that we'll keep an eye on because everybody in the industry, everybody in the patient community, everybody is interested in making sure that FDA meets its deadlines with regard to reviews, not only in the device area, but in the drug area as well as other areas. From the foods desk, there was an investigatory report in ProPublica. It said that FDA's foreign food safety inspections have hit a historic low this year. They found that from March to the end of July 2025, the number of foreign food inspections conducted by the agency dropped 30% compared to similar periods in the previous 2 years. A food safety magazine article said the drop is due to layoffs at FDA, the spending freeze in March, and significant budget cuts. This is something that we obviously have to keep track of. Everybody, and we're going to talk about foods for the rest of this podcast. All of us are affected very, very personally by the safety of our food supply. From the cosmetics desk, in late October, FDA announced that Neutrogena is recalling makeup wipes that may be contaminated with bacteria. They tested positive for a contaminant that can cause severe infections in people who are immunocompromised, who are undergoing surgery, who have chronic illness. We'll continue to keep an eye not only on this recall, but on all recalls, because they provide an indication as to how successful the regulatory process is going, and also how safe our food and drug and cosmetic supplies are. So let's turn to food safety. We have two Sarahs on the agenda today. I'll do my best to make it clear who I'm addressing during our segment. First up is Sarah Sorscher. Sarah is Director of Regulatory Affairs at the Center for Science in the Public Interest. I remember dealing with the founder of the CSPI, Mike Jacobson, many, many years ago when I was at FDA. It's a well-respected organization that represents the consumer community. Sarah deals with food safety, labeling, allergens, food additives, dietary supplements. Before joining CSPI, Sarah was at Public Citizen. She served as a law clerk for the Court of Appeals for D.C., and I just have to note that Sarah serves with me on the board of the Alliance for a Stronger FDA, which these days is playing a very active role in seeking adequate appropriations for FDA. Welcome to FDA Watch, Sarah Sorscher.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Sarah Gallo is Senior Vice President of Product Policy and Federal Affairs at the Consumer Brands Association. She oversees policy in all the various issues faced by the industry. Before joining Consumer Brands, Gallo, I'll call her Gallo, served as Vice President of Agriculture and Environment at Biotechnology Innovation Organization. So welcome to FDA Watch, Sarah Gallo.
Thanks so much.
So since we have two Sarahs today, we discussed this in advance of our getting on air here, and both wanted to be identified by their last names, Sorscher and Gallo. Just for the record, both of them said in their non-podcast lives, friends and colleagues do call them by their last names. So I will try to make sure that we know which Sarah is speaking, and sometimes refer to them just by their last names. That's not intended to be rude. It's just intended to be clear, and both have agreed to that. I want to start out with a 30,000-foot view. Start out with Sorscher. What's your take on what's happening at FDA now when it comes to food regulation? We've seen cutbacks in the budget, obviously. We now see a restoration of the people coming back in after the government shutdown. What's your view as to what's happening at FDA currently and over the past year when it comes to food regulation?
Yeah, thanks so much, Wayne. And I'm lobbying for the name Scorcher as a nickname. I think it's more compelling than Sorscher. What's so interesting about this political moment is that we have someone who's now kind of ultimately in control of FDA, RFK Jr., who's launched this Make America Healthy Again movement that really feeds off that same populist impulse that fuels my organization and my work, that outrage at the loss of control over key decisions in our lives because of the power that corporations have. So that populist impulse is empowering Republicans and Democrats to talk about food policy in new ways that wouldn't have been possible a year ago. But we're seeing that the administration is also not only targeting these big companies, but targeting consumer protection agencies like FDA. And taking some incredibly destructive steps to undermine the integrity and effectiveness of these tools and these democratic structures that we rely on to carry out consumer interests. So that is bad for consumers. And I think it's also bad for companies because it leads to a loss of trust in the food system and creates a government that can be arbitrary, not backed by well-resourced, data-driven decisions. And it's one of the reasons, Wayne, why the work that we're doing on the Alliance is so important, because it's helping to sort of fund and protect those key functions. But overall, it's it's a very strange and it's a very exciting moment where we have a lot of opportunity, but also more risk in our food system than we'll probably really see again in my generation. And so we really need accountability and a consumer voice more than ever in this moment. And that's why it's so important for consumer advocates to have a seat at the table when we're talking about policy, and why I'm really eager to be here today with you and dig in with Sarah Gallo on some of these topics that we're going to talk about.
So, Sarah Gallo, let me ask you the same question that I just asked Scorcher. What's your take on what's going on at the FDA, just generally in the food regulatory area?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I think I would start off by saying, historically, and if you think back even to where we were working in the previous administration, Consumer Brands Association has been a champion of a modernized and reformed human foods program. So we're looking at the way that the agency is structured. Certainly, we are encouraged that the human foods program now has a unified voice with one leader that has a single mission, a single budget. Wayne, as you note about the budget for the Food and Drug Administration, and that this administration has chosen, to continue the commitment of the agency when it looks at issues related to food ingredient safety and transparency. So two issues that are at the front of mind for food and beverage manufacturers, certainly areas where Consumer Brands has taken some really strong advocacy positions, certainly throughout this administration. But again, even looking historically at saying, hey, we need there to be a strong human foods program. And it's one that we were willing to go to Congress about, one that we worked across stakeholder groups and across political divides on, and again, are really happy to see that FDA has maintained that role for the commissioner of the Human Foods Program, and that they've set out a really ambitious agenda. I think it's important to note that, what's going on at the FDA right now are some changes that historically I don't think anyone would have imagined could be coming all together and sort of wrapped up in what this administration's goals are as it relates to FDA, to the Human Foods Program. And obviously, a lot of it is aligned with the Make America Healthy Again movement. So I think our general take is they're ambitious, and that the food and beverage manufacturers stand ready to work with the agency to ensure the safety of the food supply.
Let me ask both of you, do you think that there's been any change over the past year, by the past year I mean in the Trump administration, in terms of the way that the food industry is perceived by the public? That is, you have Robert Kennedy out there talking about ultra-processed foods. We're talking about foods as medicines. I know Dr. McCarry has an interest in that. Been a lot of discussion of food, some favorable, some unfavorable. But basically, has there been any change in the perception of the industry? Let me start out with Scorcher here.
Just to react to that point, we have seen broad multi-stakeholder support for a strong FDA, but in particular, we've seen broad multi-stakeholder support for funding for the Human Foods Program in the form of the alliance that Wayne mentioned. But one thing I will flag is that consumer brands and a lot of industry groups, became really interested in FDA as the state started passing policy, and the reorg of the Human Foods Program is in part the result of that. But one thing we haven't seen them stand up for is really funding the agency. And Gallo, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think Consumer Brands has really supported funding for FDA. And I think that's a key piece that's missing from some of the lobbying that your group has been doing. To this point about perception, I don't think that the public perceives a lot of the big food manufacturing companies in a positive light in terms of their sort of impact on the food system overall. There might be, some loyalty to specific brands, but I think that it's a negative view, and that has been true across political administrations. But what's different now is that it's manifesting in policy in a bipartisan way that's very new. And I think we've seen that in some of the state laws. The law that passed in West Virginia banning synthetic dyes is that politicians are standing up to the food industry lobby in a way that's quite remarkable, and one that I think the lobby is now reacting to with the launch of some new initiatives, new efforts, new spending in Washington, which we can talk more about.
Sarah Gallo?
Sure. So I would say, Wayne, as a representative of the consumer packaged goods industry, all of the members of consumer brands are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. So certainly we have, I think, a well-established historical perspective on working with the agency, on wanting to see the agency succeed, on promoting a strong FDA. So advocacy around a strong human foods program or a strong agency is not new. I think as far as the appropriations questions go, to use a good government affairs word, that's something that over the course of the past few fiscal years, Consumer Brands has actually championed an increase of $30 million for FDA, for the Office of Chemical Safety, again, being reflective across administrations of the reform and modernization that has gone on when we think about FDA's pre and post-market functions. We've played a significant role in talking about why that's important, why, again, having that strong federal regulator is something that we are aligned on. And if you look back to sort of previous years and fiscal years when we've worked with Congress on those appropriations, that is one issue where you've seen everyone across the spectrum, again, from the consumer advocates to industry, working with Congress to champion that and to champion the strength of that program.
Yeah. Let me ask you one question about the shutdown. We've just completed the shutdown. The Human Foods Program is back the way it was. How, Sarah Sorscher, this is a question for you, and then Sarah Gallo. How has the shutdown impacted FDA, and more specifically the Human Foods Program? The shutdown, 43 days. And a lot can happen in 43 days that's negative. How has the shutdown affected the Human Foods Program?
Yeah, so I would say, just kind of stepping back a bit, Commissioner McCary has generally worked to preserve, staffing in the Human Foods Program, but we did see already earlier this year that program had lost a number of teams that were doing training, communications, engagement, scheduling trips, et cetera. And we had also seen across the program a lot of early retirements and buyouts. So when you combine that with the hiring freeze, the program was already about 20% understaffed, at least, moving into the shutdown. And then during the shutdown, going without pay, being furloughed, we're probably going to see additional loss of staff, more pressure on staff to leave government. So that's sort of baseline, just overall on the workforce, a blow to morale, a blow to retention. The shutdown itself froze all of the food inspections that were not for cause, sort of outbreak investigation. And as you mentioned at the start of the call, we were already reaching historic lows on foreign inspection. We were also, FDA was falling behind on its FSMA target, Food Safety Modernization Act domestic inspection targets. And so the shutdown is going to put them even further behind on meeting those goals. People have been asking, is the current botulism outbreak for infant formula, is that tied to the shutdown? Could the shutdown have impacted that? We don't know. They could have had an inspection scheduled at that facility that was delayed for the shutdown. We're still going to have to see the details on that. Another area where they've been struggling is with just training new state and food safety inspectors, federal food safety inspectors. That whole division, that whole office that does the trainings was cut by DOJ. And so we see a lot of sort of body blows happening to the food inspection program that are going to take a long time to dig out of, and the shutdown sets them further behind.
Sarah Gallo, same question.
Yeah, I would say just one of the things that I would point out about what does happen during the shutdown, obviously, is that we see a pause in what is published in the Federal Register. So there are a number of pending regulations, including a rule on the generally recognized as safe program, Wayne, which I know you want to, I imagine we'll talk about here in just a second. But one of the most obvious things is that, you see a pause in that activity. So whether it's things like the dietary guidelines or the GRAS proposed rule, we're still waiting to see those, so that there's an obvious lag in the expectation of what's going to be there. The unified agenda for FDA previews quite a few things happening after the first of the year or in the spring that are also of interest to the food and beverage manufacturers. But just we're still waiting to see some rules that we're eager to engage in.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers, but it seems to me, just looking at the headlines in the newspapers, that there have been an awful lot of food recalls. you see the word listeria every day in the newspapers. Sarah Gallo, has there been an increase? Is there a difference that your association has noticed? I don't know whether it exists or not. I just as an N of one here, I just think that I have seen a lot more food recalls lately.
Well, I would say, food safety is obviously the number one priority for our industry. So, sort of regardless of historic trends or whether now is more or not, I really couldn't say if we've seen an uptick, as you say, but certainly, we take the food supply, the safety of the food supply very seriously. And when there are outbreaks or when there are issues that consumers need to know about or industry needs to react to, we really count on FDA as the strong federal regulator in order to, alert consumers and work with industry to correct those.
Yeah, can I chime in there as well? I think it's tricky, right? Because what you see in the news, outbreaks and recalls, and in a way, that is also a signal for how healthy our systems for catching issues are. So having an outbreak announcement means that we had the ability to solve that outbreak, and having a recall means somebody caught an issue. And so they're not the best indicators for sort of the underlying status of food safety in our country. The thing that is a good indicator is a program called FoodNet that's carried out by the CDC. And sadly, that program was recently cut due to lack of resources. And that program monitors the incidents, the underlying incidents, and it really gives a strong signal for whether our policies are working and whether the food system is getting safer or less safe. And Sarah Gallo, I want to correct the record because I did accuse you of not supporting appropriations, and it is true. You guys signed on to a letter that we helped circulate for funding for FDA's food chemicals program in FY26. So thank you for correcting the record. We do have a letter out to fund FoodNet now, which as your members, to the extent that they care about food safety and getting accurate numbers, that is also a really critical priority. So I hope you all will sign on to that. The window is still open to do so, because FoodNet is the best way for people like Wayne to know whether we're getting better or worse at food safety.
Right.
Happy to take a look at that.
Okay. We're going to take a break now, but we'll be right back. We're back. We're talking about food safety and food regulations with Sarah Sorscher from CSPI, Center for Science and the Public Interest, and with Sarah Gallo from the Consumer Brands Association. Sarah Gallo, I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between state governments and the FDA and federal government generally with regard to regulation and legislation. How have things changed this past year? And again, by this year, I mean in 2025, with regard to those relationships. The food industry has to work very closely with states on food oversight, food safety oversight. So how has that changed at all, if at all?
Yeah, well, I think there has been a significant change, Wayne. And one of the things I would point to, and I've been with Consumer Brands for about 3.5 years now. And when I first came on board, there were a handful of bills in a handful of states. And obviously, as you know, we saw upwards of 150 bills introduced in the states, and it was about 40 states. So it's now I think Sarah mentioned this earlier. It's a bipartisan effort at the state level. And I think a lot of it is being done, as we know, because the Make America Healthy Again movement has really inspired a lot of state legislators to take action and to take a look at whether or not they want to push something through their own states. So that patchwork of bills that has been introduced and enacted in some places really is what is becoming problematic for manufacturers, but also really problematic for consumers. If you think about, I live in Virginia. I might go to DC for work. Maryland's not too far away. And thinking about the fact that you could have, different laws in 3 states that are rather interchangeable in a course of my day really is painting a picture that just causes a tremendous amount of confusion and, quite frankly, a tremendous amount of cost, both for consumers and for industry. So we've seen a rapid influx in state bills. I think everyone is rightfully interested in maintaining the safety of the food supply. But at this point in time, what Consumer Brands is calling for is a national uniform standard when it comes to ingredient safety and disclosure. So thinking about one set of rules across the country, having the FDA be that source of science and risk-based evaluation that's going to give consumers that confidence. But certainly from a manufacturer's perspective, yeah, we're facing a lot different environment in 2025 across the states. I said earlier, our number one priority is food safety. That doesn't change across state lines. And we are going to follow the law in those states. So just, by the nature of connecting the dots there, we're seeing an increasingly complex landscape for food and beverage manufacturers. And again, that increasingly confusing landscape for consumers. That's why we're focused on a national standard there.
Yeah, I want to ask the same question of Sarah Sorscher, and then I want to come back to you, Sarah Gallo, and ask about the role of the states in inspections and how they support the FDA. But Sarah Sorscher, with regard to what Sarah Gallo was just talking about and the various state legislative efforts that sometimes are in conflict with federal regulations.
Yeah, and Wayne, I'll say that consumers and consumer groups really do support having a strong, well-funded FDA with the meaningful ability to review chemical safety. And the challenge that we've seen is that for decades, FDA has not been leaning into that role as watchdog for our food system. And we have some prominent examples of that. I mean, one of them we worked on for years was getting a ban on Red 3, which FDA banned from lipstick in 1990, but was allowing in, marshmallow peeps for Easter and other foods that we're feeding to kids and adults. And, the states in this context have really stepped in to serve as regulators of last resort, starting with AB 418 in California in 2023, which banned 4 additives, including Red 3. And I do think state legislation has been a driving factor behind getting widespread support for the Human Foods Program, right? Getting the reorganization, getting Jim Jones, Biden's pick to lead the Human Foods Program, coming in from Environmental Protection Agency, where he'd overseen a lot of the chemical reviews under the Toxic Substances Act. This past year, that state momentum has really exploded, including Republican-led states like West Virginia. And I would say that, if the food industry really wants a single strong regulator, they should be throwing their support behind getting a big budget for FDA, getting strong authority for FDA, and not on crushing state laws. Because the only reason these states are acting is because we've seen a failure at the federal level. And, I should mention some of the preemption that we've seen coming from, Consumer Brands, the group I mentioned earlier in the call is Americans for Ingredient Transparency. This was a group a C4 group that was launched right before Halloween, actually, October 30th. That is, as its kind of primary goal, it's preempting these state laws. And, they're very well funded, and they're targeting, the generally recognized as safe loophole in federal law as sort of a vehicle for this preemption effort. I will say, the thing that's going to solve this problem for industry is having really strong action and decisive action from FDA. And I think we're aligned on that goal. But to the extent that they're going to sort of take away those regulators of last resort, they're going to see some really, really strong opposition from consumer groups, consumer advocates, because that's an important backstop. And it's one of the things that helps get alignment around a functional FDA.
Yeah, well, let me do a little bit of a deeper dive into that. Using Red 3 as an example, when I was at FDA, I dealt a lot with the red colors. If you are concerned about Red 3, is the way to approach it to get the states to do something about it, or is it to work closely with the FDA so that there will be a single standard on across the country, because as Sarah Gallo pointed out, when you have different laws in different states, the industry can't really respond to that. The industry, everybody understands that's a challenge that the industry really should not have.
I think there's a synergy between the state work and the federal work. So with Red 3, FDA said there is evidence of carcinogenicity in animal studies to the point where we can't allow this in lipstick and cosmetic products. And then they sat on their hands for 3 decades. So they did not finally act to ban Red 3 until after California had banned it. So I do think that we need those regulators of last resort, and we can't put all of our eggs in the FDA basket. But yes, ultimately we are looking for national standards, and so having both options on the table is really critical for consumer protection.
Sarah Gallo, I want to come back to the question I mentioned before, and that has to do with state inspections, the role of the states in inspecting food facilities. That is a large responsibility of the states. Unlike in the drug area, where you have to have very, very specialized inspections, you don't have drug inspections being conducted by states very often. But what about the food area? What is the relationship now between the states and the FDA in terms of food inspections?
Yeah, well, certainly we understand the importance of those state partnerships in achieving the food safety goals that we all share. We've been very supportive of groups like AFDO and others that are looking, they're good partners with you all in the Alliance for FDA, Stronger FDA, thinking about how we make sure that they have the resources that they need, that they also have the information that they need. I think we've learned a lot about the ability of sharing information so that those food safety functions can run smoother and that they're the most informed that they can be. So we see the states as really important partners. I think, Wayne, there's a little bit of a difference between when we talk about the importance of the state inspectors in maintaining that constant surveillance and ability to deal with food safety issues, and then thinking about state legislators or others that may be looking to implement new laws in those states that they may or may not be that may or may not be based in the same kind of science and risk that we're talking about at the federal level. So I think there's a little bit of a distinction between thinking about how we look at states as partners in a broader food safety and inspection perspective, and then what we're advocating for, which is thinking about how do we have a strong national regulator so that everyone is abiding by the same food safety standards and transparency goals.
I want to shift gears, talk about GRAS. Generally recognized as safe. What changes do you see happening, Sarah Gallo, in the process for GRAS and post-market review, and what are the implications for your members?
I'm glad you asked about GRAS because I think it's certainly been one that is a rather wonky regulatory issue that has now become kind of common vernacular for all of us as we're thinking about the future of the human foods program. And really when we think about what a modernized FDA looks like and when that's responsive to the safety and transparency goals and statements that others have made across the consumer spectrum. So I think for generally recognized as safe, I'll speak on behalf of Consumer Brands Association. We support moving to mandatory notification for new GRAS notifications. That's something that has been our position for most of 2025. It's also one that is reflected directly in the Make America Healthy Again strategy document that the administration put out earlier this year. We've long understood, and I think whether it's from Secretary Kennedy or Kyle Diamantis or Dr. McCary, that GRAS reform was going to be front and center. I'd even take a step back further, Wayne, and say, when we were thinking about a modernized Office of Chemical Safety, and I provided testimony about this at the FDA at the end of 2024, that even though we were talking about post-market, it was hard not to think about those pre-market pathways, GRAS being one of them as well. When we think about what is that whole strong system that's based on science and risk that we need to have in order to have confidence about the safety of food additives before they get into the market. And then once they're in the market, GRAS is obviously a really important part of that. So we support mandatory notification. We understand that might require additional authorities being granted to Congress. And from a consumer brands perspective, that's something that we're willing to champion and work with the agency and Congress on achieving.
Sarah Sorscher, you have recently spoken out about the Better FDA Act and its potential impact on GRAS regulation. What's your take on this?
Yeah, before I answer that, I'm going to circle back on the question you asked Gallo about inspections. And I just want to flag that we do actually have a lot of state food safety laws that are pretty important. And frequently when FDA is in the middle of an outbreak investigation or they're trying to get a recall, they don't have a lot of authorities they can use swiftly. And so they'll often rely on the states to get fast action and compliance and fast enforcement. So those laws are really important. And one of the things that actually worries us about some of the preemption language that has been floating around Congress is that it does sweep well beyond this narrow scope of reform of the GRAS loophole or food additives approval. And it could sweep in some of those state pathogen safety laws. And so it's just one thing we're watching out for as we talk about state preemption is the scope and what could be impacted. You asked about generally recognized as safe. So, this is a loophole in the current law that currently the law says food additives need to be approved by FDA before they're used. But through this loophole, companies can self-certify that an ingredient is generally recognized as safe, and therefore it's not a food additive, doesn't need pre-market approval. And the way FDA has constructed this, they can do that in secret, and they don't have to tell FDA, and they don't have to tell the public. And if it's a flavor, they might not even need to name it on their ingredient list. And so we have these examples of this sort of new food ingredients entering foods. There was an outbreak in 2022 centered in California that sickened nearly 400 people and caused organ damage. And that was ultimately traced back to Terra flour, which was a novel ingredient. I guess it had been used in cosmetics before in South America, but not in food. And that was never reviewed for safety. But FDA doesn't really have the ability to double check on that. And so it took them a long, long time before they were able to actually come out and say, we couldn't find any evidence, it's not GRAS. The burden should really be on the company to show that they have established that something is GRAS. And I think one of the challenges with not having pre-market review is that there's generally no incentive for a food company to go back and conduct rigorous safety testing once a substance is already in use. The only means we really have to incentivize that and to force investment in that is a pre-market review requirement. And in my article, I talked a lot about preemption because the Marshall Bill originally included both preemption and, a system like Gallo described that would require notice in the case of a GRAS substance. That bill, thanks to widespread opposition from my group, from other groups, that preemption language was taken out. But still, we have at the core of the bill, it's actually, very lopsided in terms of how chemicals get approved. So, to get into the market, it's sort of like this very simple default process. FDA doesn't actually need to act to approve something. It just sort of slips in if FDA does nothing. And then on the back end, it's got layers and layers of process, new process, notice and comment, request for information that's being added in order to ban a chemical. And that applies not only to GRAS, but also the additives that are already on the market who have existing processes. And so it sort of functions like a lobster trap for food chemicals because they slide into the food system easily and then they're sort of locked in place. And when you add, a demoralized, defunded FDA into the mix, it's not a good scenario for food chemical safety. So we are opposed to this bill, and I think it's actually Gallo. Has CBA come out and endorsed the Marshall Bill? Have you taken a position on that?
We have not endorsed the Marshall Bill. We are looking at that GRAS bill, just like we're looking at GRAS bills that have been introduced by other members of the Senate. I think just to be clear for everyone, there has not been a preemption bill that has been introduced. As Sarah noted, Senator Marshall had spoken about different parts of his bill, but what he ultimately put out was one focused on GRAS reform. And we're comparing that right now to the GRAS principles that we've developed with our members to see where there are areas of alignment. But I imagine, whether it's GRAS or other parts of what is in the Make America Healthy Again strategy, we're going to see several members of Congress coming out with bills, and just like we do with any other issue, we'll be evaluating those.
I want to ask two more questions very briefly. One has to do with front of package labeling. Sarah Gallo, when are we going to start seeing front of package labeling?
Yeah, sure. So I think, well, Wayne, to answer your question really point blank, we do have front of package labeling in the market now. It's called Facts Up Front. So one thing to keep in mind is that, yes, again, another issue that started in the previous administration that has carried over into the current administration is the desire for the government to take a look at whether or not a mandatory front of pack labeling system is appropriate for the U.S. market. But in the meantime, things like front of pack labeling and consumer transparency are really areas of strength for food and beverage manufacturers, because it's one where we've made quite a bit of investment without the government telling us that we had to. So we have a program called Facts Up Front, which is on hundreds of thousands of SKUs in the grocery store. If you have something on your desk, or if you're listening at home and you kind of look in your cupboards when you go home, you'll see that we have front of pack labeling already on many kinds of products that you have at home. And what it does is take that important nutrition information that's on the nutrition facts panel, and it puts it right on the front of the package, as the name indicates, so that consumers know at the point of sale, right on the front of the package, they can, make the right decisions for themselves and their families. We have calories, we have nutrients to limit, we have nutrients to encourage. So for whatever an individual is shopping for, or whatever their family's needs are, if you're choosing for a certain ingredient, you want more of something, you want less of something, that information is actually out there right now. So we will be, watching closely. I know FDA, again, in that spring unified agenda, forecasted that it will be looking at issuing something on front of pack in about May of 2026. Again, that's one of those issues we're going to look for when the calendar turns to next year. But in the meantime, consumers don't have to wait for the government to do something. We do have something in the marketplace right now.
Sarah Sorscher, same question about front of package labeling.
Yeah. So, I think actually I encourage people to go and look in their cupboards to see how often they find Facts Up Front, because it is not required on all packages. And I think there's a pretty high variation about which products carry it. Also, it tends to be sort of in the bottom left and low contrast. So you see it on a lot of cake packages, but it's hard to notice. And I think, as Gallo said, it does just take the information in nutrition facts and put it on the front of the package in a different format. And what you sort of miss with that is, if you have low literacy, low nutrition literacy, it's very complicated. It mixes positive and negative. It uses percentages. And what we're aiming for, and what we've seen from the data, is that coming up with a more simplified system that clearly messages, these are the nutrients that you really need to focus on limiting in the diet, and these are foods that are high in those nutrients, is really what moves the needle on public health, on consumption, on reformulation. And so, front of package, it's one of those policies that has survived the transition. So it's unusual in that regard. It is still on FDA's agenda. And RFK Jr. has talked about labeling, and in particular, sugar labeling. He famously said sugar is poison. It's probably not poison in the sense of acute risk. And he really is correct that too much added sugar, especially added sugar from sugary drinks, is incredibly damaging to our health. And so having those front of package warning signaling high in is really critical. And it's one of the few things FDA can do to move the needle on nutrition.
Ultra-processed foods. It's been an issue, obviously, for Robert Kennedy. What's your view on that?
Yeah, FDA is looking to define ultra-processed foods. Not really clear yet how they're going to use that definition, but if it is going to have a direct impact, most likely it will be in setting a floor for industry to use sort of non-UPF, non-ultra-processed foods claims. They may also have an indirect impact in terms of being built into food policy at other agencies or within states. So we are watching that process closely, and we have submitted comments really urging the agency to target the foods with the strongest evidence of health harms with that moniker.
Sarah Gallo, final word.
Sure. So I'd say, when we're talking about food processing, I think it's important to recognize that processing actually plays a really important role in the food system, whether it's for food safety reasons, nutrition reasons, or quite frankly, providing choice and making sure that, we have safe ingredients in the marketplace where consumers have access to convenient, affordable things to feed their families. So, we wholeheartedly have followed what either the dietary guidelines or again, this new request for information on certain classifications or food processing systems have moved forward. We think it's really important that when we're giving dietary advice that it's based in nutrition and not necessarily an arbitrary processing step, and that nutrition really needs to be the guiding source of how we're having the American public understand how to have healthy dietary patterns and move towards those healthy dietary patterns, which I think is really important for a government as well as for industry. So we commented on the RFI that was recently released, and obviously those comments are public as well.
Okay, let me shift gears for a second. I'm going to turn briefly to our resource link segment. We provide our listeners with some valuable links that they may want to check out. These links will be included on our website, fdawatch.net. On the pharma side, FDA recently released new draft guidance for determining whether a comparative clinical study with efficacy endpoints is needed to support a demonstration of biosimilarity. The guidance specifies that a comparative efficacy study may not be necessary for certain sponsors to demonstrate whether the products have clinically meaningful differences. This guidance is available on FDA site and via our resource link again, fdawatch.net. On the devices side, there's another FDA draft guidance. This one outlines the agency's expectations for implementing the Quality Management System Regulation, or QSMR. It highlights information that should be included to support pre-market approval applications and humanitarian device exemption applications. Our resource link takes you to that draft guidance. On the food side, the Mead Johnson Nutrition Institute has released a resource for information on infant formulas. The initiative is called Facts About Formula. It's intended to provide information on what's really in formula and why, and outline the science behind how formula supports infant growth and address some myths and common questions surrounding infant formula. You can learn more about the initiative through our resource link, again, fdawatch.net. And on the cosmetic side, there was recently a symposium run by the Personal Care Products Council. Its CEO, Tom Myers, noted that his council is prioritizing in 2026 full implementation of MOCRA. Myers said that several key rulemakings covering fragrance allergens, GMPs, good manufacturing practices, have been delayed during this past election, year, and he emphasized that consistent science-based GMP standards are essential to assuring product quality. Our link goes to an article that outlines more about the priorities that Myers mentioned and about his organization. And again, fdawatch.net. On that note, it's time to thank Sarah Gallo and Sarah Sorscher for being such excellent guests on this episode. I want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. If you want to be a marketing partner or a sponsor or just comment on the show, you can contact us at info@fdawatch.net. And of course, check out our website, which I repeat many times during our podcast, fdawatch.net. And if you have not yet formally subscribed, not just followed us, but formally subscribed, please do so. We want to increase our subscriptions. Finally, if you're so inclined to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, it really does make a difference. And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.